Let me recap the topic, which is Occupational Safety and Health meeting on the 3C-3P model for a resilient industrial safety system. In a world where unexpected things can happen anytime, the COVID-19 pandemic is just one example of many disruptions that can impact businesses. Being resilient means being able to handle any surprise that comes our way, not just recovering from
Edmund, are you speaking? I can't hear anybody.
I thought I lost my speaker, but it seems that
of
you're the
a
same.
Yeah, I also
framework.
cannot hear.
Edmund, we lost you for about 30 seconds.
Hello?
You're back.
It is
Yes, now
articulated in the form of a framework entitled the 3C-3P model. It is a comprehensive framework that addresses all aspects of safety and proposes a holistic approach to address the same. This model is explained in the Handbook on Industrial Safety published by UNIDO in December 2021. It provides a useful guide for businesses looking to implement this model and improve their overall safety performance. Let me introduce the speaker of today's webinar. Mr. J.C. Seeker is the co-founder and CEO of Acquisition Technologies, a Singapore-founded venture. Acquisition is a non-code application that enables people-centric digital transformation, leading to operational excellence across the organization. JC is the executive committee of IOSH Singapore branch. He is also a founding and active member of Global Initiative for Future Industrial Safety, which is an international working group set up by UNIDO, GMIS, and Lloyd Register Foundation. JC has over 36 years of experience working with and leading teams across geologies and sectors. So, without further ado, let me hand over the time to JC and for his presentation. JC, please.
Thank you, Edmund. Let me share my screen. Right. Can you just confirm that you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. A very good evening, I guess, mostly for all. A very good evening to all of you who are on this call. As a matter of fact, I'd like to find out where you're from, and we'll do that momentarily. And thank you to the IOSH Hong Kong branch for having me here. Thanks particularly to Vincent, because I think a version of this presentation was what I made at a post show in Australia a few months back, and Vincent said it will probably be a good thing to repeat some of what's done in a post show to the members of the Hong Kong branch, as well as possibly Singapore. That's why we have coordinated and arranged this session jointly. Having said that, I'm obviously representing IOSH Singapore branch as well as my own organization. But as is the case with any session like this, I'd like to put a disclaimer here, which is that these are just opinions. It's a little bit of forward-looking opinions. None of this is legal advice. Please don't take this as legal advice, and please make sure you speak to a consultant before you actually implement anything. So just that disclaimer, I want to get that off the way. I usually stop with one disclaimer, but over the last 1 month or so, or 2 months, I would say, I've started adding yet another disclaimer. And I'm actually doing this for the first time here in a session like this. And that disclaimer goes as follows. The additional disclaimer is that no portion of this was generated by ChatGPT. I'm assuming a lot of you know what ChatGPT is. If you have not, you'll probably find that out very soon. If it's been making waves, the generative AI, as they call it, and I think it pretty much gives you answers to all the questions that you have. But I must say that none of this presentation was generated by ChatGPT. Before I actually get started, I wanted to get an idea of where all of you are located. So if I can, if you don't mind, I'm pretty sure most of you have a hand phone next to you. If you can just quickly scan the QR code that is out there and just enter in a single word, where are you from? Is it Hong Kong? Is it Singapore? So that we just get an idea as to where you are. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. Okay, understandable that. So HK has a right. Okay, my friends from Singapore need to show up. Okay, they're here. Right, so looks like a majority of you are from Hong Kong, which is great. And I guess Edmund and Vincent have done a good job in promoting the event among the Hong Kong branch members. Thank you so much. Thank you for this. I think it was just to get an idea as to where you're from. That's fine. So let's move on with the actual presentation. I'd like to start by, obviously, we are talking, this is a safety presentation. So I want to start by asking you a question about safety itself. I'm going to make a statement here, which is safety is the absence of illness or injury at work. I want to know, to what extent do you actually agree or disagree with the statement? I would have asked you to show hands if you're in a physical hall, which is what I did when I was doing this presentation earlier. But since we're not in a physical hall, let me go back and ask this question for you to answer digitally. So do you really agree with the statement? Do you agree with the statement about safety being the absence of injury or illness at work? Or do you disagree? Or do you partially agree with this statement? All right, most of you so far are taking the middle road. Okay. Right, I'll wait for maybe about 15 to 20 respondents. You've got 12 so far. Right. Okay. So not too many people disagree with it. A majority of you are taking the middle route, and quite a few people, about 25% of the people are agreeing. Let's take that as a representation of the audience. So about 15% of you disagree. So my intent really at the end of this presentation is to try and get the disagree group to be a little longer than this. I want more of you to disagree with this. So that'll be my end goal as a result of what is it I want to take away as a result of this presentation. If I've managed to get a few more people to disagree, I'll be very happy. Because my take on this is that the current system of what safety reports and all that are really reflecting what we are looking for in safety, which is basically the indicators to say what is the extent of which you had injuries. So whether it be a safe program of Australia, whether it be a report from the Hong Kong Exchange, which is the ESG reports, or even if you look at the workplace health and safety report from Singapore, I'll just click on that so that you know what it looks like. So those reports talk about, if you look at it, it gives you the charts, it gives you the source of data, and it tells you how's the safety performance. And these are all the charts about the number of injuries, the number of fatalities, the injuries, the fatalities by industry, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially, it's all talking about incidents and diseases and occupational injuries, as you can see. So I think if for those of you who said that this is how we measure safety, yeah, it is true. A lot of the things happen like that. If you look at, for example, some of the stock exchange requirements, some of you may be familiar with the term ESG, essentially the ESG metrics. Even the ESG metrics, when these are the ESG metrics, there are about 27 odd metrics that the companies, every listed company in Singapore is supposed to be submitting. Look at the social, and under social, you have the OHS metrics. What do they have there? So you have fatalities, you have high consequence injuries, you have recordable injuries, you have recordable work and ill health cases. So if somebody says that safety is measured by all of these things, that pretty much appears to be the case, because that's exactly what people want us to report on. That's how our dashboards look, because that's exactly what industry expects us to report. That's even true of, let's say, the Hong Kong Exchange, because the Hong Kong Exchange also has those ESG guidelines. And even there are guidelines which say, how do you report on safety? And it talks about number of work-related fatalities. So pretty much mirrors what was there in the Singapore Stock Exchange requirements. So essentially, the KPIs are all about lost time, how many injuries did we have, what kind of measures are in place, et cetera, et cetera. So the requirement across all the safety dashboards and disclosure reports is largely about our perception of safety, which is that safety is all about incidents and injuries. But I'm going to question that. I'm going to challenge that notion, and I'm going to ask you to, for a minute, don't look at safety as the absence of incidents or injuries, incidents or accidents. What could it be? How do we actually measure something with its absence? Because what is it that we can look for to say whether safety is present or not? And that's where I would propose that safety we should be looking at is by looking at the presence of what I call the 3Cs. And what are those 3Cs? The 3Cs, I call them as controls, competence, and capacity. Give me a moment for me to jump into each of these things in some more detail. We'll start with the first one, which is on controls. So what do we mean by that? Many of you on this call are probably safety professionals. So what I'm saying here is probably very, very elementary. But we all know risk management 101, it all starts with hazards. Obviously, there are hazards all around us. Now, that doesn't mean anything, but if those hazards go out of control, you end up having a risk event, which could be a trip, a slip, fall, whatever. And that risk event could have a consequence. And that consequence could be very grave at some points of time. It could be minor at some point of time. Now, obviously, not every hazard is going to result in a risk event, which in turn is going to result in a consequence. There is a probability associated with this. And there's also an aspect of the severity associated with the kind of risk event that has happened. So it may or may not translate into a very grave consequence. It could probably be a minor consequence. And typically, when we say risk, we really talk about the combination of the probability and severity, and that's what we say is risk. Now, clearly, there are hazards all around us, and there are clearly consequences as a result of those hazards if things are not in control. The only reason those hazards don't manifest into too many consequences is because we have something called controls. So we have controls here. We have controls to probably minimize the exposure to those hazards. To minimize or eliminate the hazard in the first place, or perhaps to ensure that we are protected from the hazard. Or worst case scenario, if the risk event does happen, there is some kind of a control there so that we don't have a very bad consequence. So this is typically the lowest level of control. So it's possible basically if we would have had a very grave situation if these controls were not in place. It's fine to talk about controls, but typically it's not always been easy for us to speak and measure the existence of these controls. I would say that's till now, but to some extent things have changed now because we are now entering the era of what I would call as not what I call, but what the industry calls as the fourth industrial revolution or industry 4.0. Because what industry 4.0 does is it helps us to evaluate the presence of controls and their effectiveness. So what exactly is this industry 4.0? We probably know this, but there's been a transformation of industry over the past 200 odd years or 150 odd years. We started with mechanization, which was industry 1.0, moved on to mass production, subsequently to automation. And currently we are in this generation of what we call as the industry 4.0, which is largely driven by this whole notion of cyber physical systems. And what do we mean by a cyber physical system? We are looking at, this is a NIST definition, so don't get the US National Science Foundation definition, but the key words there are, you have the physical and software components which are deeply intertwined. So you have that in the form of sensors, you have it in the form of data that's getting captured. So basically, you probably have a sensor there which can capture a data and then feed that back into another system so that the existence of a control can be monitored, its effectiveness can be monitored. So there are various aspects or various building blocks of Industry 4.0. These are some of the big ones, starting with IoT, big data, cloud, and the fact that we have huge computational power and you have software that can essentially do all this. These are all some of the so-called building blocks of a good Industry 4.0 system. Now, so what Industry 4.0 does is it helps us to kind of A, look at the existence of the controls, and B, look at its effectiveness. It's not that these are very complex systems. Not everything is complex. I know of a company in Singapore that really does what we call as tiny machine learning, where they have a little chip that is mounted on top of a clipping, which a person is supposed to do before they, for example, they clip their harness. So you can go back and see whether the harness has been clipped. It's also got a low-powered camera that captures the image and it tracks the sound of whether the harness has been fixed. You can also have more complex systems. Microsoft and a few other vendors today have systems where you can mount things onto a camera and see whether actually are we having controls in place. Is the person actually putting on his protective equipment? Is this particular person who's handling this particular equipment actually authorized for that equipment? So in other words, quote unquote, violations and other things can be possibly easily captured. You can start tagging items to find out, are these things in a zone of safety? Are they gone beyond that zone? So all of that is possible today. And all of those are really ways and means of really looking at the existence of those controls and their effectiveness. Yet another example, you can map it out. You can map a built environment and see where are these people, how many people are in a high-risk zone, how many people are in a low-risk zone. You have very, very small, low-powered tags costing a couple of dollars, which can really be mounted onto either a device or an individual can have it as their so-called smart device and track all of these things. Now, obviously, there are legal requirements to be taken care of. There are privacy issues. Now, let's keep all that aside for a moment. But at least when it comes to equipment and when it comes to sensors on board equipment, I think today Industry 4.0 opens up a huge deal of opportunities. That also, I'd like to show a picture of what the Singapore Workplace Health and Safety Institute has as what it calls as the connected work site. Essentially, some of the elements of this connected work site being one in which you have cameras, which are probably, you have drones, which have mounted cameras, which are looking at the visual activity that's going on, seeing and identifying any potential hazards, even the housekeeping of those aspects, if there are any potential areas where there could be issues. You probably have electronic permit to work systems that are in operation. You potentially have the collaboration through the designers having the BIM integration with the BIM. And most of these aspects, you have perhaps the design for manufacturing being done. So all of these are really so-called connected. So that's why they call it the connected work site. So this is the future of the connected work site. Now, if that's the future of the connected work site, earlier I showed you about those dashboards and other things which talked about really tracking number of accidents, number of incidents. What do you think should be the future of safety dashboards? Should we still be going the same old way and looking at the existence of, or rather the presence, or rather the absence of accidents and incidents? I would propose that given what we are seeing, our future of dashboard should look something like this. We should be looking not at accidents and incidents, but as a part of that, we should be looking at possibly the number of controls that we have identified as part of our safety management system. Not just the existence of those controls, how many of them are actually implemented? Possibly it's 97.3. How many of those implemented controls are actually effective? And how are these controls? Are they detection controls? Are they prevention controls? So basically, the measure that you should have, or the metric that you should have, is not about the absence of accidents and illnesses, but about the presence of controls and trending how these controls are going. Are our controls actually working? Because that's an indication. Because if you have an indication that our controls are in place, we're increasing the number of controls, and these controls are actually effective, that's an indication that you have got safety embedded into the system. So the first C, again, is the presence of controls. Let me move on to the second one, which happens to be one of my favorites, which is on competence, because this is an area that I work in quite extensively. So competence, again, we equate competence to training, but we all know that just by training people, that doesn't necessarily mean they're competent, because it's about their ability to actually work based on the training that they've got, actually put that knowledge into practice. And how do they do it? Do they do it effectively? So provision of training alone cannot be competence. There's something beyond that. I'm going to deviate a little bit and not take any example from the workplace, but I'm going to show you a short clipping. Have you ever looked at this program called America's Got Talent? Maybe in your chat window, if some of you can just respond. Well, it's a very interesting program. And this was one, I've actually taken a clipping of something. The actual program is probably a little more than 15 minutes. I've abridged it. I've shortened this just for the purpose of this particular presentation. You can find the full clipping on YouTube if you're interested. When I watched it for the first time, I must confess that it was very hard to watch. And I'll tell you why. It'll become quite apparent to you momentarily. I think I have a clipping of about 6 or 7 minutes. Give it a watch, and we'll have a quick discussion after that. It's a very interesting clip, by the way.
She's like Spider-Woman.
Wow, that's incredible.
There is no net. There is no airbag. It is all concrete beneath them. Now here comes Dad, Michelangelo.
Dude, they just climbing straight up an 80-foot building.
Yeah.
That is insane.
That's insane. That's crazy.
Look at this.
Look how wobbly. I don't mind heights, but this is ridiculous.
This is like so scary.
No harnesses, no rigging, and the whole thing just moving side to side.
Oh man. These things are swaying at least 20 feet across.
Wow. Dad seems really nervous, right?
I thought it was.
This is incredible.
Okay, I'm going to pause there, but I can only tell you that it all ended well. Again, like I said, if you're interested, please take a look at it. But let's go back and ask ourselves, we are all safety professionals here. Did someone say hierarchy of controls? So where exactly in the hierarchy of controls does this particular act come under? Obviously, there's no elimination, there's no substitution, there's no engineering control, there's no support system. There was no PPE either. But still, this was an activity. It would be naive to think that they were not ready for this. Clearly, there was something that they had which did this. And that is obviously a lot of practice and a lot of effort and a whole deal of, I would say, repetitive practice before they got there. So they had the expertise to do it. And importantly, I think a recognition that they knew what they were doing, because at any point of time, if there was going to be an issue with not being able to do that task, they would have probably stopped doing what they were doing. So I'd like to say that apart from all of these controls, there's one control which we don't talk enough about, which is really the risk competence of our workforce. Because if these individuals had that level of competence to recognize that something is harmful, they would have probably aborted the task. So yes, you have all of this hierarchy of controls, but let's not forget that one of the biggest sources of information for us, or one of the biggest areas from where we can ensure that our operations are safe, is by looking at the people within the organization and looking at the competence that exists within there, or I would, to be more specific, the risk competence of individuals at all levels in the organization. If we can tap into the individual risk competence of all people at all levels, then we probably have an additional layer of control that we don't even talk about. Because that's probably that one thing which we need to work on. Now, that's again easy to say, but how do we know whether that exists or not exists? So this is where what we've done at Acquisition is to come up with a simple way to see how can we measure the level of competence. It's not an easy task, by the way. How do we measure risk competence of an organization? We've tried to some extent, I would say, oversimplify this, but at least a very practical way of doing this. So what we've done is we've said, okay, I put people through maybe a training or whatever, and then I give them a set of questions which really has a scenario and expects these individuals to respond to the scenario. For example, I'm asking them a question on what should be the right process, or what should be the right thing I do here. Once I give an answer, in which case I've said this option I've selected, there's another button that pops up which says, how sure are you about your response? In other words, quantify the extent to which you are confident with the answer that you're giving me. So there's a little bit of a slider scale there, and you pull that slider scale and you say that this is what I am. So you've gone on a scale of, let's say, 4 to 5, you're at, on a scale of 5, you've gone up to 4 to say you're almost certain, but you're not entirely certain. So we have a little algorithm at the back end which takes all of these responses that an individual gives to all of these questions, and then comes up to say, what is this indicator that is? I'll expand this in a moment, but it comes up with what is called as a knowledge index for that person, or you could call it as a risk competence index, which is essentially a metric to say to what extent are these guys consciously aware of what they're doing. In other words, if I tell you I'm absolutely certain and I give you a right answer, that means I'm consciously aware of what I'm supposed to be doing, which is great. But then I could also be at the other end of the spectrum, I could also be unconsciously ignorant. So I could be a person who thinks I know what I'm doing, but I actually don't know the answer, but I think I know it. So I'm the person who's a very high risk person at work, because these are the kind of individuals who will probably end up going and possibly operating an equipment wrongly and resulting in some kind of an unwarranted situation. And maybe there are cases where people are sometimes unconsciously aware, which means you're plain and simple lucky, because you've got it, you figured out, you somehow thought you were not sure about it, but somehow you managed to get the right answer. And in some cases you're risky, because at least you don't know, but you still are giving me the wrong answer, but at least you know that you're giving the wrong answer. At least you're unsure about what you're saying, So this is a way in which you've identified and said that if we can map it out, and we have organizations that we are working with where they are mapping it out and saying that what's the risk competency at different levels of our organization, because we need to enhance the risk competency across the board if we have to have safe operations. So this is one way of doing this. It's probably not the only way. Obviously, you have to get the basic training and other things in place. But beyond that, this is a way of measuring what's the risk competence. Now, one of the things, again, this struck us during the time of the COVID was that we are all, as professionals, as safety professionals, obsessed with this whole concept of safe operating procedures. But then what we realized during this pandemic was sometimes an SOP may not suffice. So we actually came up with a term to say that it may not always be only a safe operating procedures. We probably need something beyond a safe operating procedure or a standard operating procedure, sorry. We might need what we call as a dynamic operating procedure, because those changes are so dynamic that what was essentially a safe operating practice yesterday is probably not safe today for whatever reason. So we shouldn't get obsessed with what we have as SOPs and be ready for the fact that we may need to complement what was originally told as the right practice with probably a correction and roll out those dynamic operating procedures, not necessarily to replace, but possibly to complement your standard operating procedures. So that's yet another aspect which we said we need to, once we roll out maybe a dynamic operating procedure, we also need to make sure that people to whom this information is being communicated are actually understanding it. So you cannot take risk competence as a static, but it needs the periodic reinforcement and upgrades with all those changes. And so we have a way of measuring and saying that post your competence or post your qualification, to what extent are you kind of keeping in touch with what's required and how are you scoring on that? Because these are all indications that the competence level in my organization may be dropping because I don't see enough of participation and I don't see them scoring well enough. So that's an indication that that risk competence that's within my organization needs to be reinforced. So that's the second C, which I'd like to talk, which I just spoke about. So we have the two C's, the first one being controls and the second one being competence. Let's move on to the third one, which is capacity. So this is a little more nebulous. I think it's not that easily defined. But when we talk about capacity, what we're trying to say here is that, yes, you want to be safe and you want to be resilient. But do we have that capacity to operate safely? I always like this image of this palm tree because this can go through all of the cyclonic winds and all that stuff. It shakes, it shivers, it moves all over, but finally when the storm subsides, it's back and it still remains stable. So I think our ability to kind of be resilient is so critical, for which we need the capacity to operate safely. And again, capacity is multidimensional. When we say capacity, we are really talking about things like money, manpower, machine, material, and methods. So how does this manifest in practice? So what we really are saying is that if we really need that resilience, it's possibly not enough if we just say that, I've qualified you as a person or I've qualified this organization. But then in the time of a crisis, do we have the financial wherewithal to kind of take on a particular shock? Is there a possibility that in case there is additional resources needed, whether it be manpower or whether it be money or whether it be machine, are there enough resources available? So this might apply in the case of an organization, or this might apply in the case of a vendor that we are dealing with or a supplier that we're dealing with. We need to make sure that there is sufficient capacity available for them to finance the so-called operational costs, which are important for us, because there is obviously a need for resources if we have to have the capacity to do it. It could also be the methods. Do we have the machine? Do you have the material? So these are all some of those so-called hard factors of capacity. And what I missed out when I first proposed this theory was the so-called soft aspects, which means that capacity is not just this hard capacity of man, material, etc., but it's also about the so-called, soft factors, which could be things like the organizational culture and things that need to exist within an organization for it to take on these shocks and for it to have that necessary ability for people to look out for each other. So you need both the hard and the soft capacity at the time of a shock, because if that doesn't happen, your system is not going to be resilient and you may not be able to survive that shock. So look for those hard and soft factors. Like I said, indicators of this are not very easy to come by. And this is, I would say, still early days. One of the first documents that is there is a report brought out by the ILO. I think this has become an actual paper, which was written by Sidney Decker and a lawyer by the name Michael Tuma from Australia, both from Australia, which talks about a capacity index, which is a metric of all of those things. It's a good paper. I don't necessarily agree with all of the points there, but I think it's early days. And I always say that if somebody wants to do a PhD in safety, a good subject to pick would be, what are those capacity indices that we need as a part of a good resilient safety system? So that's the third C, which is capacity. Let me now move on to finally say that it's about the presence of the 3 C's. So I've elaborated on all of these 3 things. Now comes the question, if this is about safety, how do we put these 3 C's into practice? Now that's where I would say that we need to start looking at what I call as the 3 P's. What are those 3 P's? So if you want a safe operating system, my hypothesis is that you would need to look at the aspects of people, process, as well as product. And what do I mean? Let me just expand on this. So when we say people, it's about looking at those occupational safety standards that we possibly need to put in place, whether it be an ILO related guideline or whether it be an ISO 45001 or any other occupational safety standard. There are many out there. But that shouldn't mean that we can ignore what is called as a process safety. You cannot say that my organization, we are operating a safety system because we have implemented ISO 45001. That's great. But you also need to consider for the relevant processes that you have within your organization, do you have the right kind of processes? Now, you don't necessarily need to go all the way to a PSM standard like what is brought out by the CCPS or OSHA, but aspects of those may need to be brought into your operating system. It could be, maybe it's change management, maybe it's asset integrity, maybe it's some of those elements there, but those elements probably apply to you, even though you may have implemented only a 45001. You cannot take just a 45001 standard and ignore those process things. And the third thing, and this is where I see a lot of ignorance of this aspect of the need for product safety. And I come with a product safety background. I spent many years with UL, so those examples are just for reference, but essentially, do I have a kite mark on it or do I have a UL mark on it? Are my products going through the necessary homologation and testing and certification? And are they safe to operate? I mean, are they ensuring that the people who are operating them or the processes that are using these products are not going to be impacted because these are listed and these are certified products? In other words, the product safety aspects need to be considered as part of a software operating system. Again, I'm mentioning this simply because when we speak to organizations, people say, I'm only the safety guy, I take care of occupational safety. It's our design team that takes care of something else. I'm not aware of what happens on the product side. And then we have a separate process safety management team, which takes care of process, and I don't deal with them. It's fine. I think that's the way it operates. That's okay. But at least there should be an awareness that we consciously need to be bringing in aspects of people as well as process, as well as product. Let me illustrate this with a couple of more examples. Some of the nuances when we talk about each of these things. When we talk about people, we're probably talking about doing hazard identification and risk assessments and putting in place those controls, which is what typically an occupational safety management system would require us to do. But when it comes to PFMEA, we don't do a 2x2 risk assessment and say we've done a risk assessment. You would probably need to do a little more, use a risk assessment tool that's more related to a process, like a process FMEA or a HAZOP study or a bow tie analysis. So those are all aspects through which you would do a little more focused risk assessment on your process. And also, to go back to the capacity, you probably need to look at your process capability studies to say, is this process actually good enough to be giving me the results that I need for the kind of work that I'm doing? So the risk assessment that you do as occupational safety may not suffice for process safety. Likewise, am I having products there? What is the risk that my product could be having? That could be, as a result of the design that I have I done a design failure mode analysis? Because that's the risk assessment I should be doing for a product. I can't do a 2x2 matrix and say, this is my DFMEA. So you need to do that. And then, is there validity that this particular product that I have has been certified and fit for purpose? I mean, is this manufacturer through whom I bought this product, is this listed? Is it approved? And has this product been proven? So those are all questions that you need to ask yourself when you look at the product safety aspects of it. Let's look at how this possibly works in the context of, let's say, a work at height. So on the one aspect, you may be looking at, again, these are just indicative. You may say from an occupational standpoint of view, we're giving people the work at height training. And from a process standpoint of view, we have a permit to work system that helps us to take care of it. But then, are we ensuring that the lanyards that we're using are in compliance with those safety regulations that are required for lanyards? Again, just an example. So that's something you would take care of. Or if you look at a scenario where you're operating in an industry environment, From an occupational standpoint of view, do we give the respiratory protection that's needed to people? Are we, from a process standpoint of view, monitoring the dust levels? And then from a product standpoint of view, are we using those explosive safe devices which comply with the ATEX directives? So you would need to bring all these three aspects together if you're really expecting to have a safe operating system. Now obviously there are going to be overlaps. And the reality is that if you look at an operating system, a perfect operating system is the zone in which you have all of these three things taken care of, which is the people, process, and product, because that's where the robustness of the system is, because you addressed all these aspects, people, process, and product. But the reality is that we don't live in a perfect world. And the reality is that there are always going to be certain variances and the way the system is implemented. So you probably have, maybe you're strong on the process and people, but you have these vulnerabilities in people. So you probably have some strength here on process and people, but you're missing out on aspects of product. Likewise, there are zones of weaknesses. And in a dynamic system, the pattern itself may change, and sometimes it may go like this, sometimes it may go like this. So you probably have a system that's going to have vulnerabilities in different areas. Our ideal situation is one in which potentially we can bring all of these things together so that you have the people, process, and product converging together. And once that happens, if this looks a little familiar to you, yes, it looks like a zero. So I would say vision zero cannot happen just by having a vision statement or a mission statement or anything like that. You need to have this focus on looking at your operating system from a perspective of people, process, and product. And when you have a convergence of all of these systems, then it becomes a perfect operating system of vision zero. So the question again is it possible? Absolutely, it's possible. How do we do it? We do it if we can focus on each of these three Ps in more detail. So just to summarize, yes, vision zero is possible. But for that to happen, we need to, A, look at whether our definition of safety is really determined by the presence or whether it's determined by the absence of accidents or illnesses. So I would postulate that safety is determined by the presence of capacity, controls, and competence. And for making that happen, you need to blend your people, process, and product safety considerations to have what I would call as a holistic safety operating system. And lastly, recognize that when we are operating in a scenario which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, you may need to complement your standard operating procedures with dynamic operating procedures so that there is a certain focus and people are aware of the changes and those changes are understood and implemented. Right, so that, like I said, this was, I think, as Edmund introduced, this was something which was first I'd written in this safety handbook, which was published by UNIDO a couple of years ago. You can always find a copy of it on the internet. Otherwise, just drop me a note. I'll be happy to send you a link. I want to go back and maybe ask the same question that I asked earlier on, which is safety is the absence of injury or illness at work. Related to that, I'm going to ask you a question. Give me a second. Based on what you've heard so far, which of these definitions appeals the most to you? Yeah, can we have a few more responses? Yeah, we are about 120 odd people in this room, so I'm hoping we can get a few more responses. Okay, my cutoff is 20. I still have only 10. Right, this is a very shy group. Right, I'm not sure how many of these people who are responding, the presence of controls are from the earlier group, which said that they believe safety should be about absence of injury or illness at work. But yeah, at least a majority of the people responding to this feel that it should be the presence of control, so which is what I started off with. So thank you for that. Right, we'll stop at that. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Look forward to questions. My contact information is here. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, happy to do that. And I'm open to questions. Edmund and Narendra, floor is yours.
Yeah, I think I just checked the questions. There is no question. Let me see again. The engineering control by safety net can be placed underneath the pole. Okay, so I think there is no question, but only some comments regarding the video which you shown. Okay, and I have one question regarding you shared one slide related to the quantifying the risk competency.
Mhm.
Okay, so and you shown like by sliding some by the slider we can decide the competency in the 4 different areas based on
Right.
the low risk or the. So what is the logic behind that? How we can quantify that response by simple slider, which is like 100%, 0%, 80%. So how we can quantify those risk behaviors?
Okay, I will probably try and share that with you with an example. Can you see my phone screen? This is not part of my plan, so this is going, I'm going
Yeah,
here.
I can see that.
Okay. So let me try and show that to you how that works. I might have to log into a particular account. Give me a second. This is not part of my plan, but yeah. So let me take an example of this. So let's say that this was a safety activity or something you were doing. Give me a second. I'm not sure if I have an example here. Yeah, I should have an example here. So let's say we are looking at a construction activity. And we want to test the competence of a person who's doing a lifting operation. Okay, I just got this in some other language. Okay. So you know that the answer to this question, should the outriggers be fully deployed, is a yes, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to say yes. So now I'm asked, are you sure or are you not sure about this? Okay. So this is where I'm going to slide and say, I'm not entirely sure. I'm 50-50. Okay. Then you're asking me, can I go beyond? So I've given you the right answer, but I'm not fully sure about it.
Yep.
So can I go beyond the safe working load of a crane? The answer is no, but let me just say 10%. And again, let me slide it and say that, where do I stand? I'm 50-50 on this answer. I'm not entirely sure. Okay. So once I do this, what happens at the background is those responses, the fact that I answered somewhere in between with the right answer and the fact that I responded wrongly gets captured. And if I go back to this particular activity, which was about the lorry crane, okay, I get feedback where I can look at the knowledge index pertaining to that particular thing, which was about lifting operations. And if you see this quadrant here, essentially this is coming from those 2 questions. So the fact that I moved the slider, because it had only 2 questions, typically you would have more than 2. The fact that I moved the slider halfway through has given me half of green and half of blue. And the fact that the other slider I moved with the wrong answer to halfway here and halfway here gives me this answer. So we've built a logic associated with it to capture and say, so there's a metric that's computed based on this quadrant, and that gives you the number. So if I were to repeat the same thing with everything being right, it would give me a different number. Okay, so there's a backend logic through which it is built.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, this was not part of my thing, so that's why I had to put that.
No problem. So another call for participants. If anyone have the questions, please type in the chat box.
if no more question, then thanks Jaycee's presentation, and I'm sure we all learn a lot now about the 3C-3P model now. So, and coming up, JC, we thank you your participation to be our guest speaker for our caption the topic, and here is the certificate of appreciation. Sorry, we have to send it to you online, and later on we will send back the original to you.
Thank you very much. Will
Yeah.
do.
Yep. So so I think that's all about the webinar. And before we leave, please be reminded that the record of tonight's webinar will be available on Hong Kong branch network page later. So thank you very much for all your participation. And that's the end of the webinar. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for-
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you, Jesse.